Aquí el equipo de Escuelas Católicas, el equipo de organización de este congreso, se volvió loco y pensó, ¿por qué no contactar con el mayor experto del mundo? No contestará, pero... Pues contestó. Contestó y hoy lo que van a ver ustedes, sus chicos van a alucinar, porque ni más ni menos que Henry Jenkins les va a hablar directamente a ustedes. Es probable que ahora en estos momentos ni siquiera se sitúen, pero les aseguro que es el mayor experto del mundo en transmedia, en este concepto de contar los relatos. Él ha estado 20 años, ni más ni menos que la MIT. Estamos hablando de la Catedral de la Tecnología y de la Innovación. Saben que la historia la escriben aquellos que la cambian, que la revolucionan. Él protagonizará los libros del futuro de las aulas. Henry Jenkins, tenerlo aquí, escucharle, por supuesto, vía online, va a ser de verdad un auténtico regalo. Van, permítame la palabra, a flipar sus chicos cuando lo sepan. Así que solo les digo eso, disfrútenlo, escúchenle, porque esto es una auténtica lección magistral. Vamos a conocer exactamente los 7 principios de la narrativa transmedia y cómo podemos aplicarlos a las escuelas.
I appreciate you accommodating me. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person for the event. It sounds enormously exciting, but I'm glad we could make this work. Let's start with the word transmedia. The word transmedia by itself is an adjective. It simply means across media. And it's a word we use to describe some sort of structured or systematic relationship between two or more media. It needs, as a modifier, it needs a noun, right? It's transmedia what? So we could talk about transmedia storytelling, we could talk about transmedia documentary, we could talk about transmedia learning, transmedia branding, transmedia performance. There are a variety of things that we could talk about transmedia achieving. But the first point, why are we using this word transmedia? It's because we live in a world where every story, every sound, every image that matters to us is going to spread past through every available media channel. It's going to spread there whether it's by a top-down decision by a media company or a policy-making organization, or a bottom-up decision by everyday people who simply want to put an image on their Facebook page or tweet a link to a video. You know, more and more, we are the system of communication that spreads ideas from one place to the other. So transmedia simply says that there's a connection going on between these, that ideas are flowing across media channels. Storytelling, if we use transmedia to modify storytelling, what we're saying is that stories today don't live in a single location, that stories are told by the entertainment industries in such a way that many media come into play. All right, so this is where we go from transmedia entertainment or transmedia storytelling to transmedia learning. So the first point I'd make to a room full of educators trying to understand this concept is that the real world comes to us in a transmedia form just as much as fictions do. So if we want to look at the leaders of the European Union, if we want to look at Merkel, for example, Merkel comes to us not just as a character in the newspaper that we read, but as a character in the evening news, a character we might hear on the radio, a character we might encounter through a website, a person we might actually see in real life, a person that we understand through the policies that impact our world. So any piece of information that affects us today is also going through this process of being unfolding to us across multiple media channels. So if we're going to help students process the world, we're understanding Merkel and the economic policies of Germany and the European Union, we need to be able to help them process information that comes at them from multiple media channels. Some of those channels are more reliable than others. We in the US talk a lot now about fake news, right? And I suspect that's a phenomenon around the world. How do we help students determine fake news from real news? How do we help students determine the biases of different communication channels in such a way that they're able to process that information and put those pieces together? That's a central challenge for educators around the world today. In a world where information flows from multiple media channels, where the information flows are more complicated than ever before, when grassroots communicators pass along information that can have a huge impact. So the world we live in is a transmediated world. So that's the first point to think about for educators. The second is our educational theory more and more talks to us about, on the one hand, multimodality, a la Gunter Kress, and on the other, multiple intelligence, a la Howard Gardner. And Howard Gardner's idea of multiple intelligence is different readers, different learners process information better through different media channels. It learns to present information through multiple media channels to their learners so that we reflect those multiple intelligences. So if we add those things together, we've got to prepare our students for a world where both creativity and news is transmedia. And we have to prepare our lessons for learners who are going to process some of those media channels better than others, depending on their multiple intelligence represented in their classroom. So that means the concept of transmedia is a fundamental one for any educator to think about as they're developing their lesson plans. The goal should be to encourage students to foster research skills to use all those media effectively, and critical reading skills to process those media critically and intelligently so we understand where that information is coming from and why that information, we put different value on different sources of information. And the lesson itself has to be designed in a transmediated way so that the teacher is using effectively the range of communication technologies in their classroom in order to reach as many different learners with that lesson as they possibly can. So that's the big picture of thinking about transmedia as it moves into education. Now, what I developed for thinking about transmedia entertainment was a series of principles that apply to the entertainment world. And a few years back on my blog at henryjenkins.org, I did a blog post. Let me pull up the title for us. A blog post that laid out systematically how to apply these to education. It's Transmedia Education, the 7 Principles Revisited, and I refer people to go there. Yeah. But the 7 principles, briefly, are this distinction between spreadability versus drillability. So spreadability is the idea that information spreads as far and wide as it possibly can and often requires very simple, compressed versions of that information in order to circulate. Whereas drillability was the idea that we like to drill into something that really matters to us. We want to follow our passions and get as deep inside of it. So the ideal learning environment combines those 2 principles, right? We want to encourage students to go as far reaching in their research and tracking down our information as we can. We want to foster spreadability. But we also want to look for those opportunities for drillability where students get deeper inside the lesson and want to really inhabit it as a space of their own mastery. Continuity versus multiplicity, second set of principles. Continuity has to do with this idea of a canon, an established body of knowledge that we expect everyone to master. In film, that continuity would be the central story. In learning, it could be whatever the core educational goals of a particular lesson are. Multiplicity is the idea that the story could be told in multiple different ways, that we could ask what-if questions in our history classes, for example, change historical variables around and try to imagine what the consequences of them might be. So multiplicity is about exploring multiple perspectives, multiple points of view, multiple outcomes, rather than seeing history or literature as a fixed narrative that we simply have to communicate to our learners. Immersion versus extractability. Immersion is this idea of getting inside something, versus extractability is taking pieces of it back with us. So immersion technologies today might include secondary worlds like Second Life used to be, or sort of multi-game-like world interfaces, but it also could include virtual reality. Or museums even, or immersive spaces we go and have an intense experience of a piece of knowledge. Extractability is that souvenir we take with us, and it's the little bits of artifacts that we keep in our classrooms. It might be an interesting rock, it might be some sort of animal specimen that's stuffed or in a jar, it might be a map, it could be anything that we extract from a larger system and bring into the classroom so students have an immediate tactile experience of that piece of knowledge. World building is this idea that in fiction, an imaginary world has to cohere. All the pieces fit together to form an underlying logic. So we believe world building is a good way to think about systemic logic, systemic learning. How do we teach people to understand systems and how the parts fit together in order to allow us to develop a deeper knowledge? Seriality is this idea of how do we chunk and structure a story so that it unfolds over time and across media platforms. In the classroom, it means this question of what does it constitute a cliffhanger in learning? It is what keeps us sustained from one lesson to the next? Is there a story arc that organizes a set of lessons together? Is there an ideal way to cluster the lesson so that it has a beginning, middle, and end, and we arrive at a certain moment of intense learning by the end of the classroom period, and students' curiosity are whet for what comes next? Subjectivity has to do with point of view. That is, what is the perspective we bring to bear on a particular story? And again, history is maybe the easiest way to think about this. So if we have a battle between two nations, do we bring both nations' perspectives into the classroom and help students to imagine why the parties were involved in this fight were fighting each other? Can we think about the different experience of the general and the man on the front line? Can we think about the women's experience on the civilian experience on the fringes of the battle? All of the different things that come together to reflect a moment in his history requires us to think about multiple subjectivities. And finally, the last principle is performance. And performance, we're really not just thinking about performance in the theatrical sense, but what do we do with the information? How do we act on the information? What is this that this lesson allows students to do differently than they would before? And in talking about entertainment, we talk about activators, attractors and activators. So the attractor is what draws us to a particular entertainment. The activators is what that entertainment invites us to do. So in the US, we've seen this wave of true crime serials on both television and in podcasting. Stories that unfold a mystery in the real life and lays out the evidence, encourages people to think through the facts as they were presented, to challenge one witness against another. And that gives the audience a variety of things to do in terms of research, debating of evidence, debating the facts, debating interpretations of facts, that very much create an opportunity for learning. So how do we think in the classroom about how we attract students to a particular subject area, make it something they passionately care about? And then what do we give them to do that enacts and performs that knowledge in such a way that they're able to put it to use? It's ultimately the question, are we learning the things we teach in our classes just because it's on the curriculum, because it's something we're required to teach? Or do we think it actually has use value for students and allows them to do something differently than they could before? And that's a challenge to think through lesson by lesson. How do they act on the knowledge? What's the experiential dimensions of learning in that particular instance? And I think that brings those principles together. And that's, I think, the biggest thing you can learn from the entertainment industry and the notion of transmedia storytelling is that they've been very successful at getting this generation of young people passionate about the stories they tell. And they've done it not by having a one-size-fits-all structure, but by allowing multiple points of entry into those stories, multiple characters. More and more, it's not the hero's journey, but a collective journey with many perspectives, many people brought together who have different knowledge and work together in different ways to solve the problems presented by a story. So that's true whether we're talking about the Avengers or we're talking about the characters that come together in Star Wars. It's a group of people from diverse backgrounds with multiple skills working together to solve problems collectively. And I think that's the challenge for this generation. How do we achieve that in the ways we teach? And it's by respecting the things that motivate the students, not shutting them out from the learning process, bringing them in, incorporating them into learning, and connecting them with the things we care about so that our knowledge, our passions are part of the process too.